My name is Helen Anderson. I'm 74 years old and I've lived in the same cedar shingled cottage in Eastern Oregon for almost 40 years. It sits at the edge of a quiet street just a few blocks from the post office and a bakery that still makes bread the old fashioned way with crackling crusts and warm centers. Most mornings I wake up before the sun crests the hills. I make a pot of coffee, not the instant kind, but real brewed coffee that fills the house with a smell I've come to associate with steadiness. I sit out on my porch in a green rocking chair that creaks just enough to remind me of its age and sip slowly as the light changes. My days are simple. I tend to the backyard garden that I started when my husband was still alive. The rose bushes have become a bit wild over the years, but I like them that way. They remind me that even something untamed can still be beautiful. I was a nurse for 32 years. Labor and delivery mostly, though. In the last decade before retirement, I worked in hospice. People often ask how I managed to handle both beginnings and endings, but I always thought they weren't so different. Both required patience. Both required love. There's a rhythm to my life now. Tuesdays I visit the library, Thursdays are for grocery runs, Sundays I bake. I keep a notebook on the kitchen counter with rotating cookie recipes and little notes in the margins, things like too much lemon last time or Zach prefers more chocolate. Zach is my grandson, at least he used to be, but I'm getting ahead of myself. In the afternoons, I sometimes walk down to the lake just past the elementary school, the same one my son Ethan went to when we first moved here after Robert died. I remember standing at the gates watching him disappear into the crowd of kids, feeling like I'd dropped a piece of my heart into a world I couldn't follow. The evenings are my favorite. I water the houseplants put on the radio, usually something soft like classical or folk, and sit near the window with a glass of water and a crossword puzzle. It's quiet mostly. Sometimes the silence feels like a comfort. Other times, it presses in heavy and close, like a reminder of something I lost along the way. There's a photo on the mantle of me holding Zach when he was just a baby, still red and scrunched up, wrapped in the hospital blanket, with the little blue and pink stripes. I remember how he smelled, warm like milk and fresh skin. I never thought I'd be the kind of grandma who lived alone watching memories more than people. I don't get many phone calls these days. Most folks text, and even then, not often. My phone sits in a little ceramic dish by the door, usually untouched. So when it rang that afternoon, I was in the backyard trimming back the lavender. I heard the faint buzz from inside, wiped my hands on my jeans, and went to check. It was Ethan. Just his name on the screen was enough to make my stomach flutter, not an excitement, but something closer to nerves. He doesn't call unless there's a reason. I answered, trying to keep my voice light, like everything was just fine. His tone was careful, like someone rehearsing lines for a role he didn't want to play. He asked how I was, then paused in that stiff way people do when they're about to say something unpleasant. He said he needed to talk to me about Zach's wedding, which was coming up in a few weeks. I said, of course. I'd been saving the date, already planning the lemon sugar cookies Zach always liked. But Ethan cleared his throat and said in that low, measured voice that, after talking it over, they thought maybe it would be better if I didn't come. Something about how big events can be overwhelming. Something about my memory, which was news to me. I stood there holding the phone, blinking into the light coming through the kitchen window. I didn't say anything. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wasn't sure he'd listen, even if I did. He added that it wasn't personal, that Melanie, his wife, just thought it would be easier this way. I could hear him waiting for me to say something, maybe even thank him for being considerate, but all I could do was stare at the sink where a bowl of dough waited to be shaped and baked. I told him, okay. My voice didn't crack. It didn't rise. It just stayed, even the way a nurse's voice stays calm even when a heart monitor flatlines. He said he'd keep in touch. I said goodbye and hung up before he could say anything more. The kitchen felt smaller after that, not darker, just tighter, like the walls had leaned in a bit. I walked back outside and sat on the porch, coffee still half full beside me, now gone cold. Everything looked the same. The sky was a clear stretch of soft blue, and the neighbor's dog barked at a squirrel like it always did. But nothing felt the same. I used to think peace was the absence of noise. Now I wonder if real peace is knowing that when the noise does come, you'll survive it. I rocked slowly, the wood creaking beneath me, and stared out at the world I thought I understood. Something had shifted. I just didn't know how much. Not yet. It wasn't the words that hurt me. It was how easily he said them, like he was crossing off an item on a to-do list, instead of telling his mother she wasn't welcome at her grandson's wedding. I stood in the kitchen long after the call ended, phone still warm in my palm, staring at the tile floor like it might offer some kind of answer. I didn't cry. I didn't curse. I just let the silence wrap around me the way grief often does without warning. Ethan had said it wasn't personal, that Melanie was just worried the event would be too much for me, that I'd get overwhelmed or forget someone's name or wander off mid-toast. He spoke in that careful tone the one people use when they're pretending not to insult you. I know how I'm seen now. A fragile old woman who bakes too many cookies and remembers too much of the past. Not quite senile, not quite sharp, just inconvenient. The wedding invitation was still on the fridge. Thick cardstock with gold lettering, the kind of thing you order when you want everything to look more meaningful than it actually is. I took it down without ceremony and dropped it into the trash can next to the sink. Then I stood at the pantry, hand resting on the cool brass knob, trying to remember why I had opened it. My fingers found the container of cookie dough I had prepped 2 weeks ago. Lemon sugar with white chocolate chips. Zach's favorite since he was 8 years old. I didn't know why I pulled it out. Maybe habit, maybe spite, maybe love, the kind that doesn't stop just because it's unwelcome. The kind that bakes anyway. I turned the oven on and moved without thinking. Measuring scoops, lining the baking sheet. The dough was still soft enough to shape, though the fridge had dulled the brightness of the lemon zest. I added just a touch more from the fruit bowl on the counter, slicing the rind clean with the same knife I've used for 30 years. The scent started to rise after 7 minutes. It filled the air with something so familiar I had to grip the counter just to stay upright. Vanilla, citrus, butter melting into sugar. It smelled like birthdays and sleepovers and messy aprons. It smelled like belonging. I sat at the table with my mug in hand, the one Zach gave me when he was 10. It says "World's Best Grandma" in fading letters. There's a chip on the rim, but I've never replaced it. Some things are allowed to be imperfect. While the cookies baked, I stared at the empty chair across from me. The one Ethan used to sit in when he stopped by on Sundays. He doesn't come on Sundays anymore. Too busy, too much going on. That's what he says. I never believed it until today. The timer went off and I moved like I was underwater. The oven door released a wave of heat and memory. I slid the cookies onto a cooling rack and waited. No music, no noise, just the soft tick of the kitchen clock and the sound of something inside me closing. Once the cookies were cool enough to handle, I packed them neatly into a clear container. I tied a yellow ribbon around the lid and wrote Zach's name on a small sticky note. No message, no signature, just 2 words. For you. I walked the 2 blocks to Ethan's house, slowly passing the same gardens and mailboxes I've seen for decades. I didn't knock. I just placed the container on their porch, straightened the ribbon, and walked back home. The wind had picked up slightly. It pushed against my shoulders like it was trying to remind me to keep moving. I listened. Back inside, I stood at the sink and watched the sky darken. The ache wasn't sharp. It was dull and deep, the kind that settles in your chest and makes you question everything you thought was true. I turned off my phone and slid it into the drawer. I didn't want to see any messages. I already knew what they'd say. Some version of "this is what's best," some variation of "we love you, but..." They never think you'll notice the but you always do. That night, I didn't sleep much. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, remembering the first time I held Zach in my arms. He had the tiniest birthmark on his shoulder, shaped like a half moon. I used to kiss it when I tucked him in. I wonder if he remembers. People talk about betrayal like it always comes loud, like shouting or slammed doors. But sometimes it comes with careful words and practiced concern. Sometimes it smiles while it cuts. They said it wasn't personal, but leaving someone out of their own family story always is. I stared at the shadow of the cookie container in my memory and thought about how strange it is to be erased so gently you almost thank them for it. But I didn't thank them. I baked, I delivered, I left the ribbon straight. That was my answer. Not loud, not angry, but there and undeniable. I was 29 when Robert died, a train derailment outside of Corvallis. He was on a night shift working overtime so we could finally fix the roof before winter. I remember the knock on the door more than I remember the funeral. Ethan was 6, too young to understand what a death certificate meant, but old enough to understand the sound of me crying through the bathroom door. I never let him see me fall apart, not because I didn't want to share the truth, but because I needed one of us to believe we'd be okay. We sold the house 2 months later, moved into a rented duplex across town with thin walls and a furnace that clanked when it kicked on. I picked up double shifts at the clinic and cleaned offices after hours. On Sundays, I took in laundry for a retired couple who lived up the hill and tipped in cash. I remember scrubbing blood from bedpans at the hospital and ink from carpet stains at the real estate office, all in the same 12-hour stretch. I'd come home with my back aching and my hands smelling like bleach and lotion. Ethan would be asleep on the couch with a book resting on his chest, too tired to make it to bed, but too proud to admit he missed me. There were nights I stayed up just to watch him breathe. It reminded me there was still something worth showing up for, that even if the world had taken Robert, it hadn't taken everything. When Ethan turned 10, he got accepted into a private school on the other side of town. I didn't know how we'd manage tuition, but I said yes before the words had even finished leaving the admissions counselor's mouth. I took out a small loan and found another weekend job at a bakery. For years, I barely slept. I packed his lunches with handwritten notes tucked between the sandwich and fruit, little lines like "make today count" or "I'm proud of you even on the hard days." He used to save them in his pencil box. One afternoon, he came home with a blue ribbon from the science fair. He held it up with both hands, grinning like it was made of gold. When I asked what he said during the presentation, he shrugged and replied, "I just told them my mom is the smartest person I know." That night, I sat in the dark living room long after he went to bed, holding the ribbon and crying into the sleeve of my uniform. Not because I was sad, because I'd never felt more seen in my life. Every birthday, I made him his favorite cake from scratch, yellow with chocolate frosting. He'd always ask for a corner piece, said it had the best frosting ratio. Those were the kind of details I remembered long after he stopped showing up for cake. When he made honor roll his junior year, I framed the certificate and hung it in the hallway. I never told him how much I sacrificed to keep him there. I didn't want him to feel like he owed me his success. I just wanted him to carry it forward. There were school plays, soccer matches, award nights. I was always the first to clap and the last to leave. Other parents knew me by name, mostly as the nurse, who always looked a little tired, but never missed a game. I remember the day he got into college. A small envelope arrived in early spring. He tore it open in the kitchen and whooped so loud he scared the cat. He looked at me with tears in his eyes and said, "We did it. We were still a team." I spent every spare dollar I had to help him get set up in his dorm, drove him to campus with boxes labeled in my handwriting, taped a note to his mini fridge that said, "Don't forget to eat even when you're busy." The first few years, he called every Sunday, told me about professors and roommates and how he missed my cookies. Then the calls got shorter, less frequent. I told myself it was normal. Young men grow busy, they build lives, but some part of me wondered when he stopped seeing me as part of his. When he met Melanie, I tried to be welcoming. I made the same cake for her birthday. She thanked me politely, but left half of it uneaten. I always notice. She'd make little comments about how I lived, how I talked. Once she said my kitchen looked vintage, like stepping into a time capsule. I smiled and said thank you, even though I knew she didn't mean it kindly. Still, I kept showing up. I kept baking. I kept listening to his updates, even when they stopped including me. Sometimes I wonder if he remembers the sacrifices. The cold nights without heat so he could have new shoes. The years I went without buying a single thing for myself. The hands that stitched buttons, signed permission slips, held him through every fever and heartbreak. Maybe he forgot, or maybe he just doesn't want to remember. But I do. Every blister, every missed holiday, every night I whispered into the dark, "We're gonna make it, baby." I remember it all. And now I wonder if he ever meant it. When he called me the strongest woman he knew, or if it was just something children say before the world convinces them strength should look different. Cleaner, quieter, less like me. I don't need a trophy. I don't even need a thank you. But I never expected to be cast out of a story I helped build. Not like this, not with silence and excuses dressed up as concern. Some people forget where they come from, others remember and just choose to turn away. I raised my son with everything I had, and now the only thing I have left is the truth. Even if they choose not to see it, I won't forget. The first time I noticed something was off, it came wrapped in a compliment. Melanie took a bite of my meatloaf during one of their early visits and smiled that tight little smile of hers. Then she said it tasted nostalgic, like something you'd find in a museum. I laughed at the time, thought maybe she just had a funny way of speaking. But the look in her eyes didn't match the words, and I remember thinking, that didn't feel like a compliment. After that, it was little things. Comments tucked between sentences, questions that sounded helpful but sat wrong in my gut. Like when she asked if I needed help sorting my prescriptions, even though I've been managing my medications just fine for years. Or when she leaned over during dinner and said with that same firm smile that Ethan might want to look into assisted living options, just in case something were to happen, just to be safe. I asked her what made her think I needed that. She tilted her head like I was a child and said, "It's not about now. It's about planning ahead, about preventing falls and emergencies and all the things that happen to people my age. I nodded. Because what else was I supposed to do? Argue that I still walk 2 miles every morning and do my own taxes, that I can tell you the exact date my water heater was last serviced and where I keep every important document. She started showing up with brochures, quietly left them on the kitchen table or tucked inside a grocery bag. Once I found one folded neatly inside the Sunday paper. Memory care centers, senior communities with soft colors and scripted names, all of them clean, all of them distant. Ethan didn't say much about it. He'd nod along or change the subject. I used to think he didn't notice. Now I think he just didn't want to choose. Then came the birthday dinner. I had spent all afternoon preparing Zach's favorite pasta and baking a chocolate layer cake with raspberry filling. Melanie brought her own salad, said she wasn't sure what dressing I used and wanted to be careful, said it in front of everyone like I was a risk. She complimented the table, the candles, the napkin folds, but never the food, never the home, never me. She took photos that night, of the meal, of Ethan and Zach, but none of me. When I asked her to send me one later, she said they didn't come out right. Too blurry, too dark, too something. I knew better. Over time, the visits grew shorter, the texts fewer. When they did come, they were group messages with no warmth. Just logistics, times, dates, what to bring. I remember one holiday gathering where I offered to make my sweet potato casserole. Melanie smiled and said, "That's sweet, but I already ordered catering, just to make things easier." I nodded and brought flowers instead. I sat on the edge of the couch and watched everyone eat food I hadn't made on plates I used to set. I felt like a guest in a house that used to be mine. Once I overheard her telling Ethan that I seemed confused lately, that I had repeated myself at dinner. I hadn't, but by the time I asked him about it, he just sighed and said I might be reading too much into things. That's the trick with people like Melanie. They don't push, they suggest, they don't accuse, they imply, and before you know it, you're defending your sanity in your own kitchen. I started writing things down, notes to myself, what I cooked, who called what I said, not because I doubted my memory, but because I knew someone else would. The hardest part wasn't the comments. It was the looks, the slow glances, the way she'd smile at Zach when I spoke like she was waiting for me to say something embarrassing, like I was already fading. She never raised her voice. She never stormed out. She just slowly, carefully moved the spotlight away from me, toward herself, and Ethan let her. He used to call me after long shifts just to hear my voice. He used to ask me for advice when Zach was a baby. He used to trust me. But now, he hesitated, always looked to her first as if needing permission to believe me. The worst day was when she told me I had missed Zach's last choir recital, that I had been invited but never responded. I checked my calendar 3 times. There was no invite, no email, no call. But when I said that, she just looked at me with that same smile and said, "Oh no, are you sure?" And in that moment, I saw it clearly. It wasn't concern, it was erasure, slow and polite and thorough. That night, I sat with the lights off thinking about how betrayal doesn't always feel like a slap. Sometimes it feels like an empty chair, like your own voice being doubted in your own house. I knew I wasn't imagining it. I knew I hadn't changed. But the way they looked at me had. And once someone decides you're fading, it doesn't matter how brightly you burn. They'll still tell the story as if you're already gone. I never expected to use it. The clause was something Jenna had insisted on years ago when we sat at her kitchen table with legal pads and mugs of tea. She called it a kill switch, said every woman should have one just in case. At the time, it felt unnecessary. I trusted Ethan. I believed in the family we had built and the values I raised him with. But Jenna, sharp as ever, just smiled and said, "One day, you might be glad you did." I had nearly forgotten about it. Tucked away in a folder at the back of my safe behind old tax forms and a copy of Robert's death certificate. But that morning after the call and the cookies and the silence that followed, I opened that safe with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. I sat on the floor of the guest room files spread out in front of me, the late afternoon light slanting across the carpet. My hands didn't shake. I wasn't angry. I was just done being invisible in a life I helped build. The trust was simple. Ethan and Melanie were listed as primary beneficiaries. Zach was next in line. Jenna had made sure the language was airtight, but right there on page 6 was the clause. If certain actions suggest manipulation or mistreatment, the trustee may reassign the distribution without consent. All I had to do was fill out 2 forms, notarize them, and notify the lawyer. I sat there holding the pen thinking about everything that had led to this. The erased invitations, the gaslit conversations, the birthday cake no one touched. I thought about all the times I chose silence to keep the peace, all the ways I shrank to fit inside someone else's version of family. And for the first time, I realized peace doesn't come from silence. It comes from being seen and protected even by yourself. I picked up the phone and called Jenna. She answered on the second ring, her voice calm but alert, like she already knew something had happened. I told her everything: the phone call, the cookies, the quiet way they pushed me out. She didn't ask if I was sure, she just said, "Okay, let's fix this." By sunset, we had a meeting scheduled with the attorney. I sat on the porch afterward, coffee in hand, and felt something shift in my chest. It wasn't joy. It wasn't revenge. It was something steadier, like placing a stone in the right place after years of imbalance. When Monday came, Jenna picked me up in her car. She had her briefcase on the seat beside her and a calm look that told me she would not let me be bullied, not this time. The law office was quiet. The receptionist offered me tea. The attorney, a woman named Clara, had kind eyes and a sharp tone. She walked me through each page like it was a map, explained where to sign what it meant and what would happen next. I removed Ethan and Melanie entirely, not because I hated them, but because I could no longer trust them to protect what I had worked for. Jenna became the primary beneficiary. Zach was named as a secondary, but with one condition. He had to visit me in person within 30 days. No text, no phone call, no explanation. Just a knock on my door, just a choice. Clara raised her eyebrows when I said it. "Are you sure?" I nodded. "Yes. If he can't see me without strings attached, then he doesn't get anything. I don't need a grandson who only remembers me in a lawyer's office." The final signature was mine. The pen felt heavier than I expected, but my hand was steady. When the last page was clipped into place, Clara smiled softly and said, "It's done." We left the building and walked into the sunlight. Jenna handed me an envelope as we got into the car. "It's the transfer receipt," she said. I moved a portion already just to get their attention. I didn't ask how much. I didn't need to know. The point wasn't the money, it was the message. I'm still here. I still matter. And I will not be erased. That night, I didn't turn off my phone. I left it on the table face up and waited. It didn't buzz right away, but I knew it would. They'd notice. They always do once something costs them. And when it finally lit up and Ethan's name flashed across the screen, I didn't answer. Because this time, the silence was mine. Not forced, not frightened, just owned, quiet, and powerful. It was the 4th day. I hadn't been counting, not exactly, but every time the phone buzzed or a car slowed down outside, my heart paused. That afternoon, I heard 3 slow knocks on the front door. When I opened it, there he was. Zach stood on the porch alone, shoulders slouched like he wasn't sure if he was welcome. In his hand was a folded piece of paper worn around the edges. His eyes were tired, not from lack of sleep, but from holding something too heavy for too long. He looked smaller than I remembered and older all at once. "Can I come in?" he asked. I stepped back and let the screen door creak open. He walked slowly, eyes moving around the room like it was both familiar and foreign. He stopped in the middle of the living room. His gaze landed on the mantel where the old clay vase he made in 3rd grade still sat just beside the photo of us in the kitchen covered in flour. "This place smells the same," he said almost under his breath. "Like sugar and clean linens and something I can't name but know." He held out the paper. It was that same photo printed years ago, faded and bent. "I've kept this in my wallet," he said. "Through college, through everything. I used to look at it when I was overwhelmed. It reminded me who I was." I didn't say anything. I waited. "I listened to the voicemail," he said. "The full one. Not the version she played for me. I found the original on Dad's phone. He had saved it in a folder labeled important." He paused. His throat moved like he was swallowing back something sharp. "She edited it, Grandma. Took out what you really said. Turned it into something cold. Something it wasn't. When I asked her why, she said it was for my own good. That you wouldn't understand what I needed." I felt the words settle into the air. Not loud, not shocking, just heavy. True. "I thought you didn't want to be there. That you were slipping. That maybe it was better to remember you the way I used to." He laughed once, but it didn't sound like joy. I didn't know what was real anymore. He took a step closer. But then I remembered this photo, and I started asking questions. I saw the notes in the wedding bags, I recognized your handwriting, the welcome gifts, the candle scent. All of it was you, but no one said your name. I kept my eyes on him. He looked like the boy who used to sit on my counter licking frosting off a wooden spoon. That boy was still there, just harder to find. I didn't want to believe you'd changed, but I let someone else convince me you had. And I'm sorry. Not because I'm supposed to be, but because I am. I reached for his hand. It was warm, a little shaky, just like when he was little and we crossed busy streets together. You came here, I said, not for money, not for guilt, for truth. That's all I ever wanted. He sat beside me on the old couch, the one we used to read on when he was too sick for school. His shoulders dropped. His breath slowed. It was the first time he'd been still in years. There was no big apology, no speech, just silence. The kind that means something's been understood without needing to be said. We sat like that for a long time, side by side, not whole, but healing. The kind of healing that starts small like a stitch you can barely feel pulling your skin back together. He didn't ask about the trust, didn't mention the money. He just said, I missed you. I didn't know how much until now. And I believed him. That night after he left, I didn't cry. I just folded the photo he gave me and placed it on my nightstand. Not as proof, but as a reminder. Reconnection doesn't come with fireworks. Sometimes it walks in with quiet eyes and old memories. Sometimes it just knocks on your door and asks to come in. Sunday came gray and cool with a thin fog rolling off the hills behind the house. I opened every window in the living room so the air would feel clean, even though my hands trembled slightly as I set 6 chairs in a circle. On the coffee table, I placed the folders one by one, each labeled, each filled with truth. The kitchen still smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and the coffee Jenna had brought over that morning. She sat quietly at the table, notebook on her lap, heels crossed at the ankle like she was waiting for a board meeting. Aunt Diana arrived next, wearing a cardigan the color of rust and a clipped pen at her collar, her presence solid and understated. Zach was early. He hovered near the fireplace, eyes scanning the mantel where his photo still stood. He looked at the others when they entered but didn't speak. His silence said more than anything else. Ethan came in tight-jawed, avoiding my gaze, holding the door for Melanie, who entered last. She wore cream slacks, a silk blouse, and that same unreadable smile. Her eyes swept the room like she was already calculating how to steer it. I stayed standing. I didn't smile. I simply handed out the folders. These are records, I said. Not arguments, not accusations, just documentation of what has happened over the last 6 months. Every page is labeled, every note time-stamped. Nothing in these folders is a guess. They all sat though Melanie hesitated a beat too long before lowering herself onto the edge of the couch. She glanced at Ethan, then back to me. Her fingers never stopped moving. Ethan flipped his folder open slowly. Zach's was already on his lap, but he hadn't moved a page yet. Jenna remained still, her pen poised but not writing. Diana opened hers with clinical precision. Inside were transcripts of edited voicemails, screenshots of group messages I had never seen, bank records showing transfers Ethan had arranged without a word, and the final revision of the trust signed and witnessed. Melanie laughed once, a dry, flat sound. This is absurd, you're treating this like a courtroom? I kept my eyes on her. You're right, I said, because proof is the only language you seem to respect. Ethan's jaw clenched. His eyes moved faster now, flipping between pages, growing more unsettled with each scan. Zach remained quiet, but he looked up then, and the weight of it made Melanie shift in her seat. Jenna finally spoke. Everything here is verified. Dates, signatures, motive, no assumptions were made. She turned the page gently. The clause about Zach's visit has already been fulfilled. Legally, everything is settled. Melanie turned to Ethan, her voice sharper now. You're really going to sit there and let them do this? To me after everything. Ethan didn't look up. You lied to me, to Zach, to everyone. I let you. The room felt still in a way that wasn't quiet. It was something else. The breath before a storm changes course. Melanie stood then, a little too fast, her tone lost its polish. She's been playing the victim for years, always needing attention, always keeping her claws in this family. Diana leaned forward, not loud but firm. No, I've seen this before. You're just louder now, and sloppier. Melanie blinked at her like she'd just remembered she was in the room. Then she turned back to Ethan, waiting, but this time, no one followed. That's when I knew. The silence had shifted. It wasn't protecting her anymore. It was protecting me. Melanie's voice rose before anyone else could speak. She pointed fingers not just at me, but at Jenna and Diana too. Said we had plotted this, turned the family against her, built a story out of nothing. Zach didn't flinch. He didn't even look at her. His eyes stayed on the folder, on the facts, on what he already knew to be true. You all want to believe the worst, she said. You want to erase everything I've done, like I didn't care for this family, like I didn't build it too. No one answered. The silence wasn't shocked. It was finished. Jenna straightened the papers in her lap. The trust has been lawfully revised. You were notified. You chose not to respond. Every transfer meets state requirements. There is no legal recourse. Melanie looked to Ethan again, but this time, her stare was brittle. Say something, she said. You're just gonna let them rewrite everything. Ethan rubbed his forehead with one hand. I don't know what's real anymore, he said. But I know this wasn't yours to decide. None of it was. She turned toward Diana next, desperate now, but Diana met her gaze head on. When people lie well, they hide behind concern. But you didn't hide, you flaunted it. You took her place before anyone gave it to you. The room held still after that. Even the air felt heavier. Melanie stepped back, her breath fast, her eyes searching the floor like it might offer a way out. I stood then. My knees were slower than they used to be, but my voice was steady. This isn't revenge, I said. It's accountability. And trust is not about money. It's about who protects your name when you're not in the room. I pulled one last envelope from the drawer behind me. I handed it to Ethan. This removes you from the trust. Permanently. Not to hurt you, but because silence isn't the same as love, and I can't keep pretending it is. He took it. He didn't argue. He didn't cry. He just nodded once, the kind of nod that comes when someone sees themselves clearly for the first time in a long time. Then I turned to Zach. I reached into my pocket and gave him a single sheet. It was already signed and notarized that morning. You came back. You asked the hard questions. You saw me. That's what earned this. He held the paper in both hands like it was more than a document, like it was a door. Ethan cleared his throat. I don't expect forgiveness, he said, but I'm sorry for all of it, for letting her take your place. I looked at him for a long time, the boy I raised, the man I'd let slip away. An apology isn't the end, I said quietly. It's the beginning, but only if your actions change too. He nodded again, slower this time, and stood to leave. No one stopped him. No one followed. When the door clicked shut behind him, the house didn't feel empty. It felt returned. That was the first time in years that my silence wasn't forced. It was chosen, and I chose to fill it with truth. The wedding came and went on a Saturday that smelled like pine needles and rain. I didn't attend. Not because I wasn't welcome anymore, but because I didn't need to go. That morning, I sat on the porch with a fresh cup of coffee and watched the neighborhood begin its weekend rhythm. Joggers passed by, dogs barked at squirrels, and a child rode her bike too fast down the hill. Everything moved like it always had, but something inside me had stilled. I didn't check social media. I didn't wait for texts or updates. I had already closed that chapter in my own way, and what came next didn't need my approval. On Sunday afternoon, Zach came by again. He wore the same suit as before, this time without the tie, and carried a white bakery box under his arm. He didn't say much, just handed it to me and nodded toward the porch. Inside were 2 slices of wedding cake, vanilla with lemon curd, his favorite since he was a boy. We sat beside each other and ate in silence, watching the sky shift from gold to gray. She kept her distance, he said eventually. Dad told her that if she even looked at me sideways again, he'd leave. I didn't ask for details, I just listened. And you, I asked, careful with my words. He looked out over the street for a long moment before answering. I don't know yet, he said. I love her, but I see things I used to ignore. It's hard to trust someone after hearing your voice come out of their lies. I didn't press him. I only said I'm glad you saw it, and I'm glad you came to me before it was too late. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the photo again. The same one of us in the kitchen, covered in flour and smiling like the world would never turn. I had it in my wallet at the altar, he said. Not for luck, for truth. When he left, I walked inside and opened the drawer beside my bed. I pulled out the wedding invitation and placed it inside a photo album, not as a keepsake, but as a record. Right next to it, I tucked the trust documents and a copy of the letter I gave to Ethan. I wasn't saving them to remember. I was filing them away to remind myself what I survived. That night, I poured myself a glass of red wine and sat in my favorite chair by the window. The cicadas hummed low in the background, and the house held its quiet like a friend who didn't need to fill the space with noise. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I had to prove anything. Not my memory, not my worth, not my place. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was undeniable. Not because anyone said so, but because I said so. Sometimes peace doesn't come with a celebration. Sometimes it comes with a decision to stop waiting for someone else to see you and instead to see yourself. I had done that, and it was enough.